There's something about the supernatural, something both captivating and terrifying. After all, we live in a modern world with no more dark corners left unexplored. We've mapped nearly every inch of the earth, and in a way that's a good thing. As humans, we crave to comprehend the unexplained and seek out the unexplored, but I think there's another side to this coin. A part of us that craves to imagine what could be. Perhaps a world where we aren't at the top of the food chain. One where humans and unimaginable beasts cohabitate as shared reality. This is the premise explored by the World of Darkness, a shared universe for a myriad of supernatural role-playing games. Pen and paper RPGs like Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf, and Mage all use this unified world as their setting, but one of these games holds a special place in my heart, despite me never having sat down to play one of its tabletop campaigns. Hunter the Reckoning tells a story of a timeline much like our own, but filled with inhuman monsters. In this modern world, there are a select few humans imbued with the power to fight these creatures, and it seemed to really speak to its core audience. Maybe it's because it focused not only on pushing back the supernatural hordes, but balancing the double life such a person would have to live. Characters in the game had day jobs, watched the news, and used the internet, a setup that was just begging for a video game adaptation. But when the game finally hit consoles of the day, there were a few questions lingering in the air. How would die-hard fans accept it, and could people with no prior knowledge of its pen and paper origins, like myself, still enjoy it? Well, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews, and I'd like to welcome you to a look behind the veil, an attempt at revisiting every entry in this short-lived but well-loved series. This is the Hunter the Reckoning Retrospective. Alright, so right up front, I have to reassert that I am not a pen and paper RPG kind of guy. I grew up in the sugar-addled 80s and 90s. My life consisted of bright, colorful cartoons and waiting for my parents to leave the room so I could resume sitting as close to the TV as humanly possible, because eyes be damned, I wanted that TV to fill my entire field of view. The point is, I couldn't actually imagine something if you paid me to. I was way too used to having very creative people in Japan dream up all of my fantasies for me. The idea of playing a tabletop RPG campaign and populating the world myself always kind of felt like ordering a burger at McDonald's and them giving me a burger kit to build myself. I don't know, it just kind of defeats the purpose of escapism for me, but hey, to each his own. I bring this up just to let you guys know I am only aware of the small bit of Hunter lore given to me from the games. So if I get anything wrong or leave anything out, show a little bit of mercy, or at the very least, I've helped you shave down the length of your scathing YouTube comment. But that's neither here nor there. So how did this turn into this? Well, that's a good question, one I'd like the answer for myself. There's next to nothing on the internet concerning the development of this game, and as far as I can tell, White Wolf wanted this property in a game and went about doing so. There, end of story. They ended up choosing High Voltage Software to develop this project, which was an odd direction to take. I mean, up to this point, these guys have produced next to nothing anyone would have ever heard about, mostly sticking to porting other people's games to consoles no one really cared about, that is, unless you were a giant fan of White Men Can't Jump on the Atari Jaguar. Which sort of sounds like the absolute worst option White Wolf could have went with, but I have to assume they weren't keen on placing all their eggs in this one basket they had no experience with, so went with the lowest bidding offer. But like I said before, I could find no info regarding this matter, so take all of this as uninformed speculation. Besides, in the grand scheme of things, who developed what really doesn't matter. How does the game play, what's its story, and does it stick to the source material? Those are the real questions here, and you know damn well we're about to answer them.
You stole them from me!
Hunter the Reckoning, instead of filling the player in on the years of stories and events that make up the World of Darkness, focuses on a small group of hunters. As the story goes, all of our main characters were present for an execution of prolific serial killer Nathaniel Arcady, and right off the bat, I kinda like the idea of our main group of characters just being the random assortment of people who would be at one of these public executions. Sadly, the night's events don't conclude with the doling out of some capital punishment. As soon as Nathaniel's turned into a nightlight, a sort of supernatural atomic bomb is set off. Apparently, the angry spirits of the people tortured and killed at Ashcroft Prison have been looking for a bit of revenge, and it was this execution that gave them the perfect venue for their reappearance in the real world. This had the runoff effect of what's called the imbuing. Essentially, people who witness events like this have the entire veil lifted back for them by beings called messengers. They're told of the demonic and spiritual threats the world is constantly under, and if they agree to fight against it, they're given special powers to aid in that goal. Our brand new hunters successfully fight their way out of the prison and board it up, thinking for some reason this would permanently solve all their problems. This line of reasoning of course resting on the presupposition that a buttload of teenagers won't break into the place to put on a rave, subsequently releasing the evil trapped inside. The early 2000s, when a rave could be squeezed into any video game plot. Now with the demonic hordes on rampage, killing and possessing anyone they can get their hands on, our hunters have returned to the city of Ashcroft to put an end to this madness once and for all. I gotta say, the general setup for HTR is incredibly engaging for me. I've always loved games like Resident Evil and Parasite Eve that take fantastical sci-fi concepts and place them in a believably modern setting, and that's exactly what we're dealing with here. The explanation the game gives for all the innocents you're saving, not actually recognizing the supernatural apocalypse going on around them, is that they simply don't see those things, instead seeing what looks like an incredibly violent mass riot.
What the hell is wrong with you people? You stay away from me!
When your characters finally figure out what's going on and how to fix it, they're helped by some kind of entity called Carpenter. He looks like something our guys would typically be hunting, but it seems like he has a stake in this game, and he needs us to complete our goal so that he can complete his. I won't spoil the rest for you, but I will say this makes for a really awesome experience. I thought the premise was relatively believable, the key word there being relatively, and the individual hunters' personalities were pretty awesome too. Sure, this isn't a very personal story, but their attitudes get to shine through in the cutscenes, depending on who you have with you. Throughout the game, you come across a handful of characters who are important enough to the story to get voice dialogue, and this ranges from relatively crappy
You opened the hole last time, Nathaniel. Who else has that kind of power?
to surprisingly well done.
I didn't want it. I didn't ask for it. I had no choice!
If you ask me, this story gets a hard recommendation if, like me, you love a good fictional twist on the recognizable modern world. I really love how the game sets up the kind of scenario that makes you feel like you're only seeing a small part of the overarching big picture. The world of Hunter the Reckoning feels grand, and while playing, I tend to imagine what other hunters are doing across the globe at that same moment. Without a doubt, I can say this is most definitely a tale worthy of your time. It may feel a bit limited in its scope, but the overall world of HTR shines through, and that's a world everyone should want to dive into. Alright, so I've sat down and thought about how to sum up Hunter the Reckoning's gameplay in the shortest, most concise manner possible, and here's what I've come up with. Remember Gauntlet? Well, it's pretty much that. It's a kind of top-down hack-and-slash centric action RPG with a huge emphasis on gameplay and the exact opposite of that for its story. Starting a game will have you choosing your character, and you'll notice each is described as their creed, which is essentially Hunter's class system. After doing a bit of research, I found that each creed interacts with monsters in some pretty unique ways. I mean, sure, they all want to kill the bad stuff and save humans, but some are dedicated to studying the supernatural, some only wish to act as a shield between innocent people and the darkness, and some just go flat out crazy when they receive their powers. Kind of a cool little tidbit. Each character has predetermined stats that can level up as you play, which is always cool to see in my opinion. And the more astute of you may have noticed, this game supports 4-player co-op, a feature we will most definitely touch on later. After you've chosen your creed, you're dropped into Ashcroft and the game begins proper. The general goal of each area is either told to you upon entering or given to you by innocents, which are just regular people. Sometimes you might need to save a person, find keys to open new areas, or... You know, it just hit me, those are about the only options I can think of. But it really doesn't matter what the end goal is. The only constant is the fact that you will end hundreds of supernatural lives by the time you complete it. Like I said before, combat is the main seller here, and the good news is it works pretty well. Kind of. Sometimes. You have a bunch of options in attacking, and all of them are handled with the right trigger. The X button is used to cycle through your main melee weapon and sidearm, and B will sort through your special weapons. These weapons, unlike your other options, have limited ammo, and you'll do well to seek them out, since they can turn the tide in your favor when shit gets real. And trust me, shit will most definitely get real. The Y button will switch between your magic spells, and these things are really damn cool. Each creed has their own starting spells like buffs, healing, or straight up holy death rays, but leveling up will add more and strengthen the ones you have. Typically, you'll be facing down large groups of enemies at a time, and for the most part, a combination of melee and long-range combat is enough to deal with the early game mobs of zombies, but even these first encounters will have you realizing just how weird this game's combat is. Okay, so this is a tough one to describe, since most things I can talk about will be shown on screen, but to the average viewer, this just looks like footage of someone who doesn't know how to play video games. So I'm going to try my best to summarize the odd stuff that's going on here, but since we haven't really discussed the basics, I'm going to pepper my complaints in with some explaining of the core mechanics. First up, and least annoying, is melee attacks, and I say that because the game is very precise in how it reads inputs. So if you're button mashing, which you definitely will be, and you accidentally hit the attack button a few more times than necessary, your character will carry out another full combo. Now, this isn't too big of a deal, and honestly it's easy to train yourself to stop, but you can't change the direction you're attacking in unless you use the right stick, which feels really damn awkward when hitting the right trigger at the same time. So if the first hit of your combo lands but the rest carry you past the enemy, you'll be stuck attacking the air directly to the left of them for however many button presses you mashed out. This can be a pain in the ass during certain boss fights, but most bosses are big as hell, so you only have to worry about this when there aren't a lot of enemies on screen, which won't be very often. Even if you miss one shambling monstrosity, there's likely to be another 30 or so somewhere around them, so don't worry too much about this. Like you've probably noticed, attacks can be chained into 3 and 4 hit combos, and you can slightly alter these by either jumping halfway through, holding the direction you're running in, or holding attack for the last button press. But mostly you'll be sticking to the old hit the attack button until everything's dead strategy. When things get a little too tense, or you just need to do a bit of long-range crowd control, you can switch to your projectile options. Your Hunter's sidearm will carry the benefit of infinite ammo, but as you'd imagine, it's not the most powerful thing in the game. Sometimes it can take as many as 4 shots to put down a low-rank enemy, and in a group of 30 or so, this can take literally forever. Luckily, there's special guns. These things really help when you're in a pinch, and they get more powerful as the game goes on, scaling with the harder and more plentiful monsters. But there's a catch. An incredibly annoying catch. It seems like becoming one of these hunters must come with some kind of advanced case of Parkinson's, because your chosen character is one of the few people on planet Earth able to aim a shotgun directly at something at point-blank range and somehow still miss. The way it's supposed to work is you are able to move your body with the left stick and either fire in the direction you're running in or use the right stick to aim and move in independent directions. This twin-stick shooter control scheme feels really amazing when it's working right. Running backwards while aiming ahead and taking down a crowd of zombies and vampires with some kind of bullpup rifle is just fucking awesome. But when you get up close, hitting the fire button sometimes feels like a dice roll. Maybe you'll hit the thing directly in front of your weapon, and maybe you won't. Sometimes a monster in the opposite direction goes down, and sometimes your bullets just miss everything in their path. I will say this isn't an all-the-time type of deal, but when you're shooting at over 100 enemies per area, the misses start to add up. So all of this may sound a bit frustrating, but it doesn't stop the game from being fun as hell. There's just something so satisfying about spraying bullets at a huge crowd of undead monsters, and just before they catch up to you, putting them all down with some kind of big-ass area of effect blast. Most of the time, this is a damn fun game, perfect for both quick sessions here or there, or intense multi-hour runs. It really just speaks to me in some odd way, and I think you guys will like it too, but there is one warning I have for you first, and it's a pretty big deal. Now, at first I wanted to label this as a difficulty issue, but the more I thought about it, the more I saw that that wasn't the case. Don't get me wrong, it's a pretty challenging game, but my issue lies with the programming and not so much the enemy placement or health values. For some insane reason, High Voltage Software didn't think it prudent to include some kind of hit stun in a game where the player will be attacking a huge number of enemies at a time. This means while you're successfully wrecking a zombie's shit with multiple swings from a sword made out of a cross, he is also attacking you, leading to this ridiculous slap fight that reminds me of that one scene from The Simpsons. Don't worry though, there is a tiny bit of stun animations in the game. Hell, you play long enough, you might even just see one. But you know who does get stunned? You, almost every time you're attacked. So all that legwork it took getting far away from that mob can be undone by getting within a 10-foot radius of some random monster that spawned in directly in your path. A trick the game likes to pull way too goddamn often. So now you're stuck completely in place as your stun animation completes, and a horde of atrocities from beyond the veil beat the absolute shit out of you. And I know this sounds bad, I mean it can get incredibly frustrating, but the good news is you gain extra lives by rescuing innocents and beating bosses. and these townspeople aren't too far off the beaten path, so it's not hard at all to build up enough lives to brute force any problem areas. And last among my complaints is the game focusing a little too hard on strong enemies with projectiles in the later areas. This effectively kills off your ability to do melee combat, since that locks you in place while 30 vampires and ghouls with shotguns draw a bead on you. My advice would be to make sure you're looking for those special weapons pickups. Trust me, you're going to want a lot of ammo for the endgame. There is of course the nearly extinct couch co-op option, and I'm happy to report it's much easier keeping the undead masses at bay with another gun at your side. Me and the wife end up playing these games pretty often, and even though it means fighting over who really most needed that life-restoring red orb, that's just part of the fun that comes with this kind of stuff. I've never actually had a Hunter game going with more than 2 players, but I imagine it's pretty damn awesome given how much enjoyment comes from just one extra Hunter being present. And speaking of 4 players, this bad boy was also ported to the Gamecube, and even though there's a bit of noticeable slowdown and massive amounts of graphical features either turned down or outright missing, it plays exactly the same. You would assume the Cube's tiny little joke of a right analog nub would get in the way, but it feels just fine to me. In fact, this Gamecube version is the first way I experienced the game. Me and my brother saw its case on the shelf at a local Blockbuster and biked it back to our house. We had hours of fun with it, and when he decided to finally go to sleep, I just kept on playing all through the night. When I eventually hit a boss I couldn't kill on my own, I would just restart the stage and run around leveling up before trying again. Although I was very surprised to find something that never bothered me before but gets on my nerves a lot now that I noticed it. With both versions of the game, the R trigger is used to attack, but as you guys probably know, the triggers on a GameCube have a very tactile click sound and a long travel time when pressed. This became incredibly clear to me while trying to get footage while my wife slept in the other room. Also, that long travel distance from the initial press of the trigger to the activation of it can really mess up your timing. But I did get used to this as a teen, and I'm pretty sure you will too if this is the version you want to try. Okay, so I know I came down pretty hard on this one for a bit there, but I can't stress this enough. It is an incredibly fun time despite its flaws. Yes, it's janky as all hell, and there are parts of the game that will frustrate you, but what Hunter feels like to me is an amateur development studio taking a stab at something sort of outside of their wheelhouse, and I honestly can't fault them for that. This game really feels like a labor of love, and sure, these guys didn't have the funds to give it some much needed polish, but it most definitely accomplishes its intended goal, and that's to put players in a large area and throw as many bloodthirsty creatures at them as the Xbox's processor can physically handle. Like I said before, Hunter the Reckoning can often feel like a small budget affair when gameplay is concerned, but you're likely to notice the lack of funding has also bled into the visual department, which isn't the bad news it sounds like. Hunter is still a really interesting looking game, but it can feel a little sparse as far as menus, interface, and 2D assets go. On the plus side though, a huge amount of effort has been put into making these levels you play in very detailed and effective at immersing you. The city streets feel like ground zero for some kind of demon apocalypse, and I really like the interior parts of Ashcroft Penitentiary. Like I've said a million times by now, I am an absolute sucker for realistic looking modern settings, and these levels are designed in a way that really drives that feeling home. As for the hunters, each one looks recognizably unique and pretty damn interesting as far as design goes. That halfway point between your typical person with a day job and a Western fantasy archetype makes these guys look really damn cool, and big props for making the Judge Creed an actual preacher. I don't know why, but I always end up playing as Father Cortez. For some reason I really can't explain, something about a trench coat wearing, sword swinging holy man just hits all the right places in my brain. On the opposite end of the coin, the enemies you come across kind of run the gamut between really cool looking to something you would see as a Halloween decoration at a cut-rate party shop. I really like the zombies and bondage leather bedecked backflipping vampires, but these stone gargoyles brought to life with magic just look a little dumb if you ask me. That being said, I don't know a lot about this game's RPG roots. For all I know, these guys could be a cool nod to monsters frequently seen in the tabletop games. The magic spells at your disposal are pretty well done here. Either thanks to a small budget or dedication to grounding things a bit in reality, these special effects are kept to a minimalistic aesthetic, which really helps them not stand out too much from the more realistic looking setting. In particular, I do have to mention Carpenter's character seemed very cool to me. All of his bandages and random spikes really brings out the part of me that loved hanging out in Hot Topic as a teen, and his voice is just too damn cool to deny.
When are you going to learn that you're not hunters? You're sheep with shotguns.
And honestly, that's everything I could come up with. Hunter is a game with an obviously small budget, but graphics that manage to work well most of the time. But you guys know me. I'm not about to close this one out without checking out the other system that called Hunter home. About 6 months after HTR graced the Xbox, High Voltage had a Gamecube port ready to go, and for something that jumped from the most powerful game console of its day to a machine with a much less impressive spec sheet, this port is really interesting. Of course, there was a lot of the original that had to go in the process, but the result of this is a few changes that kind of makes this version its own beast. That being said, there will be a few subtractions you'll notice right from the start. Most notable is that a lot of the light sources are missing in this port, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, lighting effects have always been a big drain on resources, but sadly this impacts the look of the game pretty hard. Levels now look relatively flat in comparison, which really shows in the very first area. Look at the glow that the fire casts on the rest of the subway in the Xbox release. Without that same level of environmental lighting, things just don't look as nice. Not to follow up one bad thing with another, but there's one more element that saw the chopping block, and it's the noticeably lower res textures across the board. Since the game's view is damn near top down, the reduction in ground textures will jump out as very blurry looking, especially if you're familiar with the original. There can also be just a bit of slowdown, but I found zooming the camera in helped mitigate this. That being said, it's not so bad that you'll be forced to play like this, but in areas where it bothers you, there's at least something that can be done about it. And after all those gripes, I'm happy to say there's one thing the Gamecube port holds over the Xbox version, and that is a much sharper 480p image. But that comes with a lot of qualifications. First off, as you guys may know, I'm still using a very cheap, very prone to noise no-name brand component cable off of eBay for my Xbox, and I find that I get a pretty blurry image with it. On the Cube, I'm using Eon's GCHD Mark II, which I will be honest, I am absolutely in love with. This thing gives me the pure, untouched digital video straight from my GameCube's digital out port. In comparison, my Xbox's signal has a lot more conversion than the chain, since it needs to convert its digital video to analog internally, then pass it to the FrameMeister, which converts it back to digital. I should probably also mention that I'm using a nifty little utility called Swiss, which lets me force 480p on my GameCube, which is a lifesaver with a game library that for whatever reason chose not to allow progressive output in a majority of its games. So yes, you have a noticeably sharper picture here, but it's not exactly your most common use case. But still, let's compare every option available because you know that's what I love doing. Here we have both versions of the game, and I've included both footage upscaled by the FrameMeister and raw 480p footage straight from each console, so you know just what to expect regardless of your setup. As you can see, the Cube is far and away the sharpest picture, with or without upscaling, but to be honest, the blurriness of the Xbox's 480p gives the illusion of some kind of anti-aliasing, or like a smooth, furry look. I kinda like it. And then there's the bonus of much better lighting and more detail over on the green side. Honestly, this was a pretty cool situation for me because I really couldn't find either option to be objectively better or worse than the other. Each brings an assortment of pros and cons to the table, so hey, feel free to grab whichever version works best for you and your setup. And I think that's about it for the technical details. We went over how it plays, looks, and works, so should you be looking at an imbuing of your own? And I say absolutely. Hunter the Reckoning is a mess in a lot of ways, and it can at times feel janky as hell, but it also has a boatload of heart. Its world is interesting and dark, and the gameplay is really satisfying once you get acclimated to its quirks. Which is no small list to be sure, but let's be real here, this game gives you the chance to sit side by side with 3 of your friends and run through a horde of zombies while swinging a battle axe and shooting an Uzi. I feel like I shouldn't have to say anything else, but I definitely will next time when we take a look at the one and only Hunter game to hit the PS2. Could we possibly get an authentic HTR experience on a console that's already the least powerful contender of its day and lacks the out-of-the-box support for 4 players? Well, I hope you'll join me to find out right here on the Hunter the Reckoning Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for checking out the first entry in this series with me. I really love these games, so I hope I've convinced some of you to try them out. If so, maybe I could also convince you to check out my Patreon where you can help fund more full series retrospectives like this one. If top-down hack-and-slash RPGs aren't your bag, I have my Resident Evil and Parasite Eve retrospectives linked here on screen, and I will say these are some of my proudest works here on the platform, so I hope you dig them. Well, I'm out of here, guys. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you all later.